Section 2. Not until dusk did Gregor awake from his heavy, almost comatose sleep. Probably he would have awoken around that time anyway, even if he hadn't been roused, because he felt sufficiently rested and restored. Still, it seemed to him as though a hurried footfall and a cautious shutting of the door to the hallway had awoken him. The pale gleam of the electric street lighting outside showed on the ceiling and on the upper parts of the furniture, but down on the floor, where Gregor lay, it was dark. Slowly he rose, and groping clumsily with his feelers, whose function he only now began to understand, he made for the door, to see what had happened there. His whole left side was one long, unpleasantly stretched scab, and he was positively limping on his 2 rows of legs. One of his little legs had been badly hurt in the course of the morning's incidents. It was a wonder that it was only one, and it dragged after the rest, inertly. Not until he reached the door did he realize what had tempted him there. It was the smell of food. There stood a dish full of sweetened milk with little slices of white bread floating in it. He felt like laughing for joy because he was even hungrier now than he had been that morning, and straightway he dunked his head into the milk past his eyes. Before long he withdrew it again in disappointment. It wasn't just that he found eating difficult on account of his damaged left flank. It seemed he could only eat if the whole of his body, panting, participated. More that he disliked the taste of milk, which otherwise was a favorite drink, and which his sister had certainly put out for him for that reason. In fact, he pulled his head away from the dish almost with revulsion and crawled back into the middle of the room. In the living room, the gas jet had been lit, as Gregor saw by looking through the crack in the door, but whereas usually at this time his father would be reading aloud to Gregor's mother, or sometimes to his sister from the afternoon edition of the newspaper, there was now silence. Well, it was possible that this reading aloud, of which his sister had written and spoken to him many times, had been discounted of late. But it was equally quiet to either side, even though it was hardly possible that there was no one home. What a quiet life the family used to lead, Gregor said to himself, and staring into the blackness, he felt considerable pride that he had made such a life possible for his parents and his sister, and in such a lovely flat. But what if all peace, all prosperity, all contentment were to come to a sudden and terrible end? So as not to fall into such thoughts, Gregor thought he would take some exercise instead, and he crawled back and forth in the room. Once, in the course of the long evening, one of the side doors was opened a crack, and once the other, and then hurriedly closed again. Someone seemed to feel a desire to step inside, but then again had too many cavils about doing so. Gregor took up position right against the living room door, resolved to bring in the reluctant visitor, in some way, if he could, or if nothing more, at least discover his identity, but then the door wasn't opened again, and Gregor waited in vain. Previously, when the doors were locked, everyone had tried to come in and see him, but now that he had opened one door himself, and the others had apparently been opened in the course of the day, no visitors came, and the keys were all on the outside, too. The light in the living room was left on far into the night, and that made it easy to verify that his parents and his sister had stayed up till then, because, as he could very well hear, that was when the 3 of them left on tiptoed feet. Now it was certain that no one would come into Gregor's room until morning, so he had a long time ahead of him to reflect undisturbed on how he could reorder his life. But the empty, high-ceilinged room, where he was forced to lie flat on the floor, disquieted him, without him being able to find a reason for his disquiet, because after all, this was the room he had lived in these past 5 years. And with a half-unconscious turn, and not without a little shame, he hurried under the sofa, where, even though his back was pressed down a little, and he was unable to raise his head, he straightway felt very much at home, and only lamented the fact that his body was too broad to be entirely concealed under the sofa. He stayed there all night, either half asleep, albeit woken by hunger at regular intervals, or kept half awake by anxieties and unclear hopes, which all seemed to lead to the point that he would comport himself quietly for a moment, and by patience, and the utmost consideration for the family, make the inconveniences he was putting them through in his present state a little bearable for them. Early the next morning, while it was almost still night, Gregor had an opportunity to put his resolutions to the test, because the door from the hallway opened, and his sister, almost completely dressed, looked in on him with some agitation. It took her a while to find him, but when she spotted him under the sofa, My God, he had to be somewhere. He couldn't have flown off into space. She was so terrified that in an uncontrollable revulsion she slammed the door shut. But then, as if sorry for her behavior, she straightway opened the door again and tiptoed in as if calling on a grave invalid or even a stranger. Gregor had pushed his head forward to the edge of the sofa and observed her. Would she notice that he had left his milk, and then not by any means because he wasn't hungry, and would she bring in some different food that would suit him better? If she failed to do so of her own accord, then he preferred to die rather than tell her, even though he did feel an incredible urge to shoot out from under the sofa, hurl himself at his sister's feet, and ask her for some nice tidbit to eat. But his sister was promptly startled by the sight of the full dish, from which only a little milk had been spilled round the edges. She picked it up right away, not with her bare hands but with a rag, and carried it out. Gregor was dying to see what she would bring him instead, and he entertained all sorts of conjectures on the subject, but never would he have been able to guess what in the goodness of her heart his sister did. She brought him, evidently to get a sense of his likes and dislikes, a whole array of things, all spread out on an old newspaper. There were some half-rotten vegetables, bones left over from dinner with a little congealed white sauce, a handful of raisins and almonds, a cheese that a couple of days ago Gregor had declared to be unfit for human consumption, a piece of dry bread, a piece of bread and butter, and a piece of bread and butter sprinkled with salt. In addition, she set down a dish that was probably to be given over to Gregor's personal use, into which she had poured some water. Then, out of sheer delicacy, knowing that Gregor wouldn't be able to eat in front of her, she hurriedly left the room, even turning the key just as a sign to Gregor that he could settle down and take his time over everything. Gregor's legs trembled as he addressed his meal. His wounds, too, must have completely healed over, for he didn't feel any hindrance, he was astonished to realize, and remembered how a little more than a month ago he had cut his finger with a knife, and only the day before yesterday the place still had hurt. I wonder if I have less sensitivity now, he thought, as he sucked avidly on the cheese, which of all the proffered foodstuffs had most spontaneously and powerfully attracted him. Then in rapid succession, and with eyes watering with satisfaction, he ate up the cheese, the vegetables, and the sauce. The fresh foods, on the other hand, were not to his liking. He couldn't even bear the smell of them, and dragged such things as he wanted to eat a little way away from them. He was long done with everything, and was just lounging lazily where he had eaten, when his sister, to signal that he was to withdraw, slowly turned the key in the lock. That immediately stung him out of his drowsiness, and he dashed back under the sofa. But it cost him a great effort to remain there, even for the short time his sister was in the room, because his big meal had filled out his belly, and he was scarcely able to breathe in his little space. Amidst little fits of panic suffocation, he watched with slightly bulging eyes as his sister, all unawares, swept everything together with a broom, not only the leftovers, but also those elements of food that Gregor hadn't touched, as though they, too, were now not good for anything. Then as she hastily tipped everything into a bucket, on which she set a wooden lid, whereupon she carried everything back out. No sooner had she turned her back than Gregor came out from under the sofa, stretched, and puffed himself up. This was how Gregor was now fed every day, once in the morning, while his parents and the maid were still asleep, and a second time after lunch, when his parents had their little lie-down, and his sister sent the maid out on some errand or other. For sure, none of them wanted Gregor to starve, but maybe they didn't want to confront in so much detail the idea of him eating anything. Perhaps also his sister wanted to spare them a little grief, because certainly they were suffering enough as it was.